Why do I suddenly have a British accent? I woke up and asked my wife Annette if she wanted coffee, and she started laughing so hard she nearly fell out of bed. I realized I was talking like I'd lived in London my entire life. I tried to say something else in my normal voice, but it came out sounding like Benedict Cumberbatch had possessed my body. Annette thought I was doing a bit and told me to knock it off, but I genuinely couldn't make my regular American accent come out naturally. I could force it if I really concentrated, but it sounded exactly like a British person doing a terrible American impression. Annette had to call my work and tell them I had laryngitis, because I couldn't face explaining this to anyone. My doctor said it was probably foreign accent syndrome, which can happen after strokes or head trauma. He ordered an emergency MRI thinking I'd had a mini stroke in my sleep, but the scan came back completely normal with no signs of any stroke or bleeding or tumors. Annette started getting frustrated when I had to call into work for the third day claiming I was sick. The neurologist suggested it might be psychogenic and sent me to a psychiatrist who specialized in conversion disorders. When the anti-anxiety medication didn't work after 6 weeks, Annette accused me of not taking it properly because she thought I was enjoying the attention. My friend Greg thought maybe I'd been hypnotized at the comedy show we'd gone to the week before. We called the venue, but they said the hypnotist never did anything with accents. Annette moved into the guest room saying she couldn't sleep next to someone who was committed to a lie. The speech pathologist wondered if I'd had childhood exposure to British English that was somehow resurfacing. My mom confirmed I'd never had a British nanny or teacher, and we'd never lived abroad. She dug out old home videos from when I was 3, and I had a perfect Midwest American accent. Mom stopped inviting me to family dinners because she said my fake accent upset everyone. A coworker suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, since that can cause neurological symptoms. We had the fire department check our house, but the levels were completely normal. The inspector said he'd never heard of carbon monoxide causing accent changes anyway. My biggest client threatened to pull their $2 million contract because they'd specifically requested American representatives. I tried speech therapy, but the therapist said something strange was happening. I wasn't just speaking with a British accent, but using British grammar patterns and vocabulary I shouldn't even know. I was saying whilst instead of while, and spelling color with a U without thinking. When she couldn't help me, Annette said it proved I was doing it on purpose. Then I remembered I'd had dental work done right before this started and thought maybe the anesthetic had caused nerve damage. The dentist said he'd only use standard local anesthetic that couldn't possibly affect speech patterns. Annette found apartment listings on her laptop and didn't even try to hide them anymore. A researcher at Mayo Clinic thought it might be a rare autoimmune condition affecting the brain. They ran dozens of blood tests looking for antibodies that might attack speech centers. Every test came back negative. I got fired the day we lost the $2 million account, and Annette said she couldn't be married to someone who refused to stop lying even when it cost them everything. My sister found an article about people developing accents after severe allergic reactions. I got tested for every possible allergy, but came back negative for all of them. The allergist said food allergies don't work that way anyway. Annette filed for separation, saying she needed to be with someone she could trust. We tried everything from acupuncture to checking for Lyme disease to brain parasites. One doctor even suggested multiple personality disorder with a British alter ego, but the psychological evaluation ruled that out. Every theory fell apart, and I'd lost my job and my wife, and still sounded like I'd grown up in Southeast London. The speech pathologist who'd been studying my case called 6 months later, saying she'd found something in old medical journals from the 1960s. She'd discovered 3 other cases exactly like mine with American patients who suddenly developed British accents with no medical cause. She'd tracked down one of the doctors. We drove 3 hours to meet him, and he was 92 years old, but his mind was sharp. When I spoke, he grabbed my wrist and stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. He asked me to say schedule, and when I pronounced it the British way, he started shaking his head, muttering, "Not another one." The speech pathologist asked him what he meant, and he looked around like someone might be listening before pulling out an old notebook from his bedside drawer. He flipped through yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for and turned the notebook toward me to show me 4 words that he said would finally explain everything. The 4 words stared back at me in faded blue ink. Functional Neurological Disorder Syndrome. The old doctor's fingers shook as he pointed to each word slowly. He pulled out another yellowed page covered in cramped handwriting from decades ago. The speech pathologist leaned over my shoulder to see better, while the doctor started explaining what those words meant back in the 60s. He said the brain could create real physical symptoms without any actual damage to the structure. The pathologist grabbed her notebook and started writing down everything he said. The doctor turned more pages showing case notes from 3 different patients he'd treated. Each one had developed a British accent out of nowhere, just like me. He traced his finger along the notes, pointing out how all 3 had been under extreme stress before it started. One patient had just lost his business and was facing bankruptcy. Another had gone through a messy divorce while dealing with her mother's death. The third had been working 80-hour weeks trying to save his failing marriage. The doctor said their brains had somehow grabbed onto British English as a way to escape the pressure. The speech pathologist asked him to explain the pattern he'd mentioned earlier. He flipped to a chart he'd made tracking each patient's progress over months and years. 2 of the patients never got their American accents back no matter what treatments they tried. The third one improved slightly after 3 years, but only when he stopped fighting against it. My stomach felt heavy as I stared at those charts showing years of unchanged British accents. The doctor looked directly at me and said the ones who fought hardest against it seemed to get stuck deeper. We sat there for another hour going through his old notes while he explained every detail he remembered. The speech pathologist took photos of every page with her phone for later study. When we finally left, the doctor grabbed my arm and wished me better luck than his patients had. The drive back felt longer with this new information weighing on me. The speech pathologist kept glancing at me while she drove but didn't say much at first. About halfway home, she started explaining that FND was now recognized as a real neurological condition. She said doctors understand it better now than they did in the 60s. The brain's software could have problems even when the hardware looked perfectly fine on scans. She compared it to my brain downloading a British language pack and deleting the American one during stress. The explanation made sense, but also scared me because it meant this was really happening. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 patients from the 60s. I kept wondering if I'd be stuck like this for years like they were. The speech pathologist called to check on me and could hear the worry in my voice. She said she'd been researching FND all night and found someone who might help. A specialist named Gita Graham studied linguistic features in neurological conditions at the university. The pathologist had already called her and explained my case. Gita wanted to meet me as soon as possible to document everything properly. I agreed immediately because I needed someone who wouldn't think I was faking this. 3 days later, Gita showed up at my apartment with 2 large cases of recording equipment. She set up microphones and cameras in my living room like she was building a studio. For the next 3 hours, she had me read different passages and say specific words. She recorded me saying the same sentences over and over from different angles. She made notes about how I dropped R sounds at the end of words. She measured the exact shape my mouth made when I said different vowels. She timed the rhythm of my speech down to fractions of seconds. She had me say neighborhood names from London I'd never heard of before. When I pronounced them perfectly, she got excited and made more notes. She confirmed my accent was specifically from Southeast London, not just generic British. She could even narrow it down to particular neighborhoods based on certain sounds I made. The scientific approach made me feel less crazy than I had in months. Someone was finally treating this like a real medical condition instead of accusing me of lying. After all the recording, Gita sat down to explain what she'd found. She said my brain wasn't just mimicking British sounds, but had somehow absorbed entire language patterns. The grammar structures and vocabulary choices matched native Southeast London speakers perfectly. She asked if I'd had any exposure to British English before this started. We spent the next 2 days going through my entire life looking for connections. I remembered listening to BBC podcasts during my commute for the past 5 years. I'd also watched British shows on streaming services when I couldn't sleep. Gita got excited and said my brain had been storing all that data without me realizing it. When the extreme stress hit, my brain activated all that stored British English at once. She explained it like my mind had a backup language system that took over when the main one crashed. The theory made more sense than anything else doctors had suggested so far. Gita said she knew someone who could help me work with this instead of against it. She gave me the number for Francine Lyle, who specialized in treating FND cases. Francine used special techniques that combined speech exercises with trauma processing. I called her that afternoon, and she could fit me in the next week. When I met Francine, she immediately explained that fighting the accent would only make it stronger. She compared it to quicksand, where struggling makes you sink deeper. She said I needed to work with my brain instead of battling against it constantly. The approach was completely different from all the speech therapy I'd tried before. During our 3rd session, I asked if Annette could come to have Francine explain everything. I called Annette that night, but she refused to come to any sessions. She said she was tired of enabling what she called my delusion. The rejection hurt worse than when she'd moved out months ago. It meant she would never believe this was real, no matter what proof I showed her. I realized then that our marriage probably wouldn't survive this. My savings were running out fast without my job, and I needed to do something. I found Ross McCarty's name online as an employment attorney who handled discrimination cases. When I met him, I brought all my medical documentation from the past months. He read through everything carefully and said we might have a case for wrongful termination. FND was recognized as a real disability under federal law. My company should have provided accommodation instead of firing me for something medical. Ross started gathering all the documentation we'd need to file a formal complaint. The bills kept piling up while Ross worked on the case, and I realized I couldn't afford our mortgage payments anymore without my salary. I started packing boxes while Annette came by to collect her things, neither of us saying much as we divided 12 years of shared possessions. The real estate agent put up the for sale sign, and I watched from the window as neighbors slowed down to stare at it. 3 weeks later, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 40 minutes away, where nobody knew about my accent situation. The movers took most of the furniture since Annette wanted the dining set and bedroom suite we'd picked out together. I sat on the floor of the empty house hearing my British voice echo off the walls in a way that made everything feel even more unreal. The apartment was cramped, but at least the rent was manageable on my dwindling savings. I set up my laptop on a card table and started applying for remote positions where video calls wouldn't be required. Most American companies never responded, but then I noticed something interesting happening with the UK-based job listings. A London startup founder emailed back within hours saying my cover letter showed exactly the communication style they wanted. During our phone interview, he mentioned my accent made me sound more trustworthy to their British clients than their previous American contractors. 2 more UK companies responded positively that week, and suddenly I had 3 potential clients interested in my services. Francine had me start recording daily voice journals, where I read the same paragraph from a news article every morning and evening. She wanted to track any patterns in how the accent changed throughout the day, or in different emotional states. The recordings showed my Southeast London pronunciation got thicker when I was tired or stressed, especially the way I dropped R sounds and changed my vowel shapes. We identified that phone calls made it worse, but reading familiar childhood books sometimes brought back hints of American sounds. Mom called demanding I come to Sunday dinner, and when I explained I was still working with specialists, she said I needed to stop indulging myself and just talk normal. I told her she could either accept this was a real medical condition, or we could take a break from family events until she educated herself about FND. She started crying and put Dad on the phone, who said I was being dramatic and hurting my mother for no reason. I hung up and sent them links to medical journals about functional neurological disorder, but they never acknowledged receiving them. Geeta had me doing intensive pronunciation drills where I tried to consciously add American R sounds back into specific words. I managed to say car with a slight R sound if I concentrated incredibly hard and positioned my tongue exactly right. The effort left me exhausted, and I could only maintain it for maybe 3 or 4 words before my brain defaulted back to the British patterns. She recorded everything and warned me not to get too excited since recovery in FND cases was unpredictable, and forcing changes too hard could actually make things worse. Request US to Dreads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Ross sent a formal complaint to my former employer with documentation from 5 different specialists confirming my FND diagnosis and explaining how the condition qualified for workplace accommodation under disability laws. Their legal team responded 2 weeks later with a settlement offer of $8,000, which Ross called insulting, considering I'd lost a 6-figure salary. He gathered evidence of other FND cases that had received proper accommodation and prepared a counter-proposal showing the company's legal exposure. If we pursued litigation, I spent hours searching online until I found a support group specifically for people with FND and foreign accent syndrome. Reading through the posts, I discovered dozens of people dealing with similar situations, including a teacher who'd had a German accent for 12 years after a car accident. They shared stories about lost jobs and ruined relationships, but also practical advice about finding understanding doctors and navigating insurance claims. One woman posted that she'd given up trying to get her original accent back and focused instead on rebuilding her life around the new reality. Annette finally agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown to discuss separating our joint accounts and dividing the remaining assets. When I calmly explained the neurological basis of FND using Geeta's research papers, she actually looked surprised and admitted she'd been reading about it online. She said she understood intellectually that it was real, but couldn't get past feeling like I'd chosen to abandon our life together. We agreed to start mediation instead of hiring separate lawyers, which would drain what little money we had left. During a particularly stressful week dealing with legal paperwork and insurance forms, I noticed something strange happening with my writing. I'd typed color and realize and whilst, without thinking about it, my brain automatically using British spelling patterns. Geeta said this showed the accent changes went deeper than just speech and were actually rewiring my language processing at a fundamental level. She documented everything for her research while I stared at my computer screen wondering if I'd eventually forget how to write in American English completely. The 92-year-old doctor from the 1960s cases called Ross directly after I signed a release allowing him to share my medical information. He agreed to write a detailed letter for my disability claim, including his case notes from the 3 similar patients he'd treated decades ago, showing the same pattern of stress-induced onset and long-term persistence of the accent changes. Ross said this historical documentation could be the key evidence we needed since it proved this wasn't some new condition I'd made up, but something with documented medical precedent going back 60 years. I spent the next week setting up my phone on a tripod in my living room and recorded myself talking about FND for 23 minutes straight. I explained how the brain can create real physical symptoms without any damage showing up on scans, and how stress can trigger the nervous system to basically rewire itself in weird ways. I showed them printouts from medical journals and the letter from the old doctor, and kept my voice calm, even though my hands were shaking the whole time. I uploaded it to YouTube as unlisted, and sent the link to Mom and Dad and my sister and all the cousins who'd been whispering about me faking it for attention. My sister called me 3 hours later, and I could hear her crying before she even said anything. She kept saying she was sorry and that she didn't know conditions like this could be real without brain damage showing up on tests. Mom watched it but didn't call for 2 days, and when she finally did, she just said maybe we could try Sunday dinner again, but I'd have to understand if people still had questions. 3 months had passed since I'd started seeing Francine, and we were doing these exercises where she'd have me read nursery rhymes and childhood songs to try accessing old muscle memory patterns. One session I was reading Mary Had a Little Lamb, and suddenly the word little came out with an American accent for just a second, before snapping back to British. Francine grabbed my arm and made me repeat it 40 times until I could sometimes get that American sound on purpose, but only with that specific word in that specific phrase. We tried other childhood songs, and I managed to get American sounds on Twinkle Twinkle and parts of Happy Birthday, but it was exhausting and gave me headaches trying to force my brain to access those old pathways. Ross called that same week saying my old company had increased their settlement offer to $32,000 after he'd sent them documentation of 3 other FND cases where employees got full accommodation and kept their jobs. It wasn't close to what I'd lost with my 6-figure salary, but it would keep me from losing my apartment and give me time to build up freelance work without panicking about rent every month. Ross said we could fight for more, but it would take years in court, and there was no guarantee we'd win since FND was still so misunderstood by most people. I signed the settlement papers in his office, while he explained they'd also agreed to a neutral reference that wouldn't mention the accent situation at all. 2 weeks later, I showed up at Mom's house for Sunday dinner, even though she hadn't actually invited me, and walked into the dining room where everyone went quiet when they heard my British accent. I pulled out Gita's research papers and calmly explained FND while passing around the medical documentation and keeping my voice steady, even though Uncle Frank was rolling his eyes. My 7-year-old nephew broke the silence by asking if I was like Harry Potter now, and could I do magic too, which made everyone laugh nervously. Some relatives whispered to each other, and Aunt Carol kept staring at me like I was contagious, but my cousin Beth actually asked real questions about how it happened and seemed genuinely interested in understanding. Annette had agreed to meet with Francine privately to learn about FND, and when she came out after 90 minutes, her face was pale, and she looked like she'd been crying. She found me in the waiting room and sat down without looking at me, and said she finally believed it was real, but that didn't change anything about us. She said watching someone's entire personality shift overnight, even from a medical condition, was too much, and she couldn't stay married to someone who felt like a stranger, even if it wasn't my fault. I told her I understood, and we both sat there crying in that beige waiting room, while other patients pretended not to notice. The UK startup I'd been doing trial work for sent me an email offering a permanent remote position with benefits after my 3-month trial ended. They said on our next video call that I was their secret weapon for British clients who trusted me immediately because of my accent, and one guy joked that I sounded more British than half their London office. The salary was less than my old job, but having steady income again with health insurance felt like getting a huge piece of my life back. Gita had been studying my writing patterns and discovered I was unconsciously switching between American and British grammar without realizing it. I'd write I have got instead of I have gotten, and use whilst in the middle of otherwise American sentences, and my spell check was going crazy trying to figure out what language I was using. She created these exercises where I had to consciously choose which grammar system to use, but warned me that full accent recovery was probably not going to happen, and I needed to start accepting this might be permanent. During meditation sessions with Francine, we'd sit in her office with the white noise machine going, and she'd have me explore who I was beyond my accent or my old career. I realized I'd built everything around external things like my job title and my marriage and my American identity, and when those got stripped away, I didn't know who I was anymore. She said this forced reinvention might actually lead somewhere healthier if I could stop fighting against it and start building something new. The settlement check arrived by certified mail, and I immediately paid off the credit cards I'd been maxing out and the 3 months of back rent I owed, and put the rest in savings for emergencies. Ross had managed to get the neutral reference agreement in writing, so future employers would just hear I'd left for medical reasons without any details about the accent dispute that had caused everything. 6 months had passed since the diagnosis, and I'd stopped desperately trying every possible cure or treatment to fix my accent. Francine said this acceptance was actually the first step toward any improvement, because the constant pressure to get better was creating more stress, which was making the FND worse in this vicious cycle I couldn't break out of. Mom called me 3 weeks later while I was making breakfast in my tiny kitchen. She said she'd been watching documentaries about FND and reading medical journals online. She told me she finally understood it was a real condition and apologized for not believing me. She asked if I'd come to Sunday dinner, but said we needed to set some ground rules first. I told her I'd come if nobody made comments about my accent being fake or asked me to try talking normal. She agreed and said she'd already warned everyone to treat me with respect or leave. That Sunday felt weird sitting at the familiar dining table with my British accent filling the room. My nephew kept asking me to say different words just to hear how they sounded, but at least he wasn't mean about it. The mediator's office smelled like old coffee and printer paper when Annette and I met to work out our separation agreement. She'd brought all our financial documents in a neat binder with color-coded tabs like she always organized everything. We went through our bank accounts and retirement funds and the equity in the house we'd already sold. She didn't try to claim I was faking my condition to get more money in the settlement. We both started crying when we signed the papers, but there was relief mixed in with the sadness. The mediator said we were handling things better than most couples she saw. I found an FND awareness group online that was looking for volunteers to share their stories. The speech pathologist who'd found those old cases from the 1960s joined our advisory board. We started creating pamphlets and websites with information that would have saved me months of confusion. I wrote blog posts about my journey and recorded videos explaining what FND felt like from the inside. Other people with the condition started reaching out saying my story helped them feel less alone. The UK startup scheduled our first team video call, and I was nervous about meeting my new colleagues face to face. When my face appeared on screen, they all started laughing, saying I sounded posher than the Queen. One guy from Manchester joked that I had a better British accent than half their London office. They didn't care about my medical history or how I got the accent. They just wanted to know if I could handle the workload and meet deadlines. Geeta sent me a copy of the linguistics journal where she'd published her case study about my accent patterns. She'd kept me anonymous but included all the data about my grammar switching and vocabulary changes. She said my case was helping researchers understand how the brain processes different language systems. Reading about myself in clinical terms felt strange, but at least something useful came from all this mess. The moving truck barely fit down the narrow street to my new apartment building. It was smaller than my last place, but in a better neighborhood where I could walk to the grocery store and coffee shops. The British accent didn't sound so weird echoing off these walls that had never heard my American voice. I hung pictures and arranged furniture, trying to make this tiny space feel like home. Dad called while I was unpacking boxes in my new kitchen. He cleared his throat a bunch of times before finally apologizing for taking Mom's side. He said he'd thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but could see now that I was stable and working. He asked if we could start over slowly, maybe with coffee once a month. I said yes, but warned him my accent wasn't going away. During my session with Francine, she pointed out something I hadn't noticed myself. I'd stopped apologizing for my accent every time I talked to someone new. She said the shame was lifting even if the accent stayed the same. She called it integration instead of recovery, which meant accepting this as part of who I was now. My sister texted asking if I wanted to meet her friend who had chronic fatigue syndrome. She thought we might have stuff in common since we both had invisible illnesses people didn't believe. We met at a quiet coffee shop and immediately bonded over doctors not taking us seriously. She told me about years of being called lazy or depressed when she was actually sick. We exchanged numbers and started texting about the weird things people said to us. Having someone who understood medical gaslighting without needing explanations felt amazing. The divorce papers came by certified mail 6 months after we'd signed the separation agreement. The waiting period was over, and our marriage was officially done. Annette had included a handwritten note on her personal stationery. She said she was sorry for not believing me sooner and hoped I'd find happiness. She wrote that she'd been seeing a therapist who helped her understand why she'd reacted with so much anger. I wrote back wishing her well and meaning it. The accent that had destroyed my old life was slowly becoming just another part of my new one. A year after everything started, I sat in the neurologist's office while he typed chronic FND with linguistic features into my medical record. He printed out the diagnosis and handed it to me like it was some kind of prize. The insurance company actually accepted it and started covering Francine's therapy sessions, which saved me hundreds of dollars a month. My UK company called the next week saying they wanted to promote me to team lead because British clients trusted my accent more than actual British employees. The American team members said I was easier to understand than our Manchester office, which made no sense, but I wasn't complaining about the Rays Christmas rolled around, and Mom invited me to dinner for the first time in months. Nobody said anything about my accent except my nephew, who handed me his Harry Potter book and asked me to read it in my cool voice. Dad passed the potatoes without making eye contact, but at least he was in the same room. The FND support group met every Tuesday at the community center, and that's where I met Sarah, who used a wheelchair during her paralysis episodes. We started getting coffee after meetings, and she never asked why I sounded British, and I never asked about her legs giving out randomly. She understood what it meant when people stared at you for something you couldn't control. Francine cut our sessions down to once a month since I was handling things better and stopped trying to force my old accent back. She said I'd integrated the British voice into my identity instead of fighting it, which counted as success in FND treatment. Geeta called one afternoon saying her research paper about my case won some big linguistics award and asked if I'd come to the ceremony. I sat in a hotel ballroom listening to her explain my grammar patterns to 200 linguists who took notes like I was some rare bird. Sarah and I found a 2-bedroom apartment with wide doorways for her wheelchair and good internet for our remote jobs. We called ourselves the neurologically interesting couple and laughed about it while cooking dinner together. The old doctor's daughter called 8 months later saying her father had passed away, but she'd found his notebooks in the attic. She mailed me 3 leather journals filled with notes about those 1960s patients who'd developed British accents just like mine. Reading their stories felt like finding family I never knew existed, even though they were strangers from 60 years ago. I set up my phone to record myself reading the same paragraph I'd been practicing for 2 years. When I played it back, I could hear tiny American sounds creeping into certain words, but mostly it was still Southeast London. Geeta said this partial integration was normal, and expecting full reversal wasn't realistic after this long. My company needed someone to fly to London for client meetings, and figured I was perfect since I already sounded local. The plane touched down at Heathrow, and everything felt backwards because my accent finally matched the voices around me. Walking through London streets, hearing my own voice reflected back from shop clerks and taxi drivers was the strangest kind of homecoming. The clients assumed I was British until I mentioned being from Ohio, and they looked at me like I was playing some weird joke. The hotel room overlooked the Thames, and I stood at the window talking to myself just to hear how my voice fit with the city sounds below. Sarah texted asking how the trip was going, and I sent her a video of me ordering fish and chips from a street vendor. The vendor didn't even blink at my accent, which felt like the most normal interaction I'd had in 2 years. Flying back to America meant becoming the oddity again, but at least I had a job and Sarah and a life that worked. The customs agent at JFK asked if I was visiting from the UK, and I just said yes because explaining took too much energy. Sarah picked me up at the airport in her adapted car, and we drove home to our apartment with the wide doorways. She decorated while I was gone, hanging pictures of us at various FND events and support group picnics. The British accent that had cost me my marriage and first job had somehow led to this better life I couldn't have imagined. Geeta sent me the published journal with my case study, and seeing my story in academic language felt like proof I wasn't crazy. The neurologist's official diagnosis let me get disability accommodations at work, even though my employer didn't really need them. Mom called more often now and only occasionally slipped up and asked if I was better yet, before catching herself. Dad had started introducing me to his friends as his son, who has that medical thing with accents, which was progress from calling me a liar. Sarah's paralysis episodes happened less when she wasn't stressed, and my accent stayed consistent when I wasn't fighting it. We took care of each other in ways that people with normal nervous systems couldn't understand. The promotion meant I could afford better insurance that covered new FND treatments that were being developed. Researchers kept contacting Geeta asking to study my case, and she forwarded their requests for me to consider. One researcher from Johns Hopkins wanted to fly me out for a week of brain scans, but I turned him down because I had too much work to catch up on. Mom called that weekend asking if I could explain FND one more time because her book club kept asking about my British thing, and she wanted to get it right. I sent her the video I'd made explaining the medical stuff, and she watched it 3 times before calling back to say she finally understood it wasn't fake or mental illness. She started forwarding articles about FND to the whole family and correcting anyone who said I was faking or that it was all in my head. Having her defend me at family gatherings instead of apologizing for me changed everything between us. I decided to write about my experience for Medium since so many people in the support group said there weren't enough first-person FND stories online. The article took me 2 weeks to write because I kept second-guessing every word, but Geeta helped me edit it down to just the facts. Within 3 days, it had 20,000 views, and my inbox filled with messages from people saying they'd been struggling with similar symptoms for years without knowing FND existed. One woman in Canada said my article gave her the courage to push for proper testing after 5 doctors dismissed her German accent as attention-seeking. Another guy from Texas said he showed it to his wife, who finally stopped accusing him of faking his sudden Scottish accent. The comment section turned into its own support group, with people sharing resources and doctor recommendations. During a big presentation to our London clients, I caught myself halfway through realizing I hadn't worried about my accent once that morning. The words just flowed out in my Southeast London voice while I clicked through slides about quarterly projections. My coworkers didn't even mention it anymore, and new hires assumed I'd transferred from the UK office. The constant mental energy I'd spent fighting my own voice for 2 years had finally stopped draining me. Sarah and I had been together 18 months when she suggested we go to the FND support group meeting where we'd first met to celebrate our anniversary. Everyone there remembered us from those early days when we were both struggling to accept our conditions. Halfway through the meeting, Sarah stood up and announced we had something to share, then dropped to one knee right there in the community center. She pulled out a ring and said, "Marrying me would be the smartest thing her messed-up nervous system ever did." The whole room erupted in cheers, and someone's service dog started barking, and the woman with seizures started happy crying. People in wheelchairs and with walking sticks and tremors and tics all celebrated with us because they understood that love doesn't require perfect bodies. 3 years had passed since that morning when Annette laughed at my coffee question, and my whole life fell apart. Now I had a steady remote job that paid better than my old one, and a fiancé who understood chronic illness from the inside. My apartment with Sarah had grab bars in the bathroom and a wheelchair ramp we'd installed ourselves, and neither of us felt weird about the accommodations. The accent that destroyed my first marriage had led me to this better life I couldn't have imagined. The speech pathologist who'd driven me to meet that old doctor called to check in every few months, and we'd become actual friends. She said my case had changed how she approached FND research, and she'd published 3 papers using my data. We met for tea whenever she was in town, and she always laughed when I ordered Earl Grey because of course I did now. She brought her new research assistant once who stared at me like I was some kind of medical celebrity, which felt weird, but also validating. Our wedding happened at the same community center where we'd met, because Sarah wanted our FND family there. I stood at the makeshift altar in my rented suit, listening to my own voice echo off the walls as I promised to love Sarah through flare-ups and remissions. My parents sat in the front row, finally accepting this was my life now, and Dad even smiled when I pronounced schedule the British way. During my vows, Sarah's sister officiated from her wheelchair and managed not to cry until the rings part. My work friends mixed with support group members, and everyone danced badly to terrible music, and it was perfect. Looking back at everything from where I am now, I can see how those 4 words in that old notebook saved me by giving me permission to stop fighting myself. Functional neurological disorder syndrome explained why my brain had latched onto British English during the stress of almost losing that huge contract. The American me who worried about client impressions and perfect presentations is gone, but the person who emerged speaks with hard-won wisdom about adaptation. My Southeast London accent isn't a symptom anymore, but just my voice telling my story. Well, that was definitely a journey to share with you all. Kinda makes you look at things a little differently, right? Thanks for sticking around with me. Like the video, it helps more than you think.